Imagine this. A powerful CEO, dressed in his finest suit, walks into a 5-star restaurant for a blind date. The table is set for two. The candles flicker. The wine breathes. But as the minutes stretch into hours, no one shows up. That's where our story begins. A night that should have ended in disappointment, but instead turned into something unforgettable. A night where the man who had everything discovered what he was truly missing. But before we dive in, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? Drop it down in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. All right, let's begin. Ethan Cole had everything most people only dream about. At just 36 years old, he had climbed from an ordinary childhood into a life of wealth, influence, and prestige. His name was known in boardrooms across the city. His face graced the covers of business magazines, and his company was celebrated as one of the fastest growing in the industry. To the outside world, Ethan was the definition of success. He lived in a penthouse that overlooked the skyline, drove cars most people only admired from a distance, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who never had to ask twice for what he wanted. But beneath that polished surface was something he rarely admitted, even to himself. Success had come at a cost. Endless workdays, constant travel, and the heavy burden of responsibility had left little room for genuine companionship. He had friends, yes, but they were colleagues, clients, or people who wanted something from him. Romantic connections had been even harder to come by. Some women were drawn to the image of Ethan Cole, the CEO, but very few had ever seen Ethan the man. And in quiet moments, when the city lights shimmered through his window and the silence of his penthouse pressed in, he felt an emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill. So when a close acquaintance suggested he go on a blind date, he surprised himself by saying yes. Ethan wasn't the type to gamble on chance meetings, let alone sit across from a stranger and hope for sparks. But something about the suggestion lingered. Perhaps it was the way they had described her. Vanessa, elegant, intelligent, ambitious. Someone who they insisted could match him, not just in success, but in spirit. Maybe, just maybe, this was the kind of person who could see past the numbers and the titles. Someone who could talk to him without measuring what he was worth in dollars. That was how Ethan Cole, a man known for his control and decisiveness, found himself walking into one of the city's most exclusive restaurants on a quiet evening. The room was warm, lit by golden lamps that cast soft glows across white tablecloths. A small quartet played gentle music near the corner, their melodies weaving to the low hum of conversation. Couples leaned across tables with soft laughter. Waiters moved with practiced grace, and the aroma of wine and freshly prepared dishes filled the air. The maitre d' greeted Ethan by name and led him to a private corner table reserved just for him. He sat down, perfectly poised, exuding the effortless composure that had become second nature. On the outside, he looked calm and unbothered, but inside there was an undercurrent of anticipation. Blind dates weren't his world. Deals, negotiations, and board meetings were predictable. People rarely surprised him anymore. But tonight carried a sense of uncertainty, a rare vulnerability he hadn't felt in years. He checked his watch. 10 minutes early, of course. Ethan Cole was never late. He folded his hands neatly on the table and glanced at the door, waiting for Vanessa to arrive. He pictured her in his mind, sophisticated, confident, someone who would walk in and make an impression. After all, that was the kind of woman people always said he needed. Someone polished, someone who fit seamlessly into his world. But even as he imagined the evening unfolding, a quiet doubt tugged at him. What if this was another shallow encounter? Another evening of small talk about vacations and designer labels. Another conversation where he was seen not for who he was, but for what he represented. He pushed the thought aside, determined to give this night a fair chance. For all his success, Ethan Cole was a man who longed for something more. A connection that couldn't be bought, a conversation that didn't feel rehearsed, a moment where he could stop being the CEO and simply be Ethan. And so he sat in that elegant restaurant, waiting for Vanessa, unaware that the night ahead would take him down a path he never could have predicted. Because before the night was over, Ethan's blind date would not just fail to appear. He would find himself face to face with someone entirely unexpected. Someone who belonged to a world very different from his own. Someone who would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself. And what she would do next would leave Ethan Cole stunned, questioning not only the night, but the very life he had built. Ethan sat in the soft glow of the restaurant, his posture composed, his suit perfectly pressed, every detail reflecting control he carried into every aspect of his life. At first, he told himself there was no reason to feel uneasy. Blind dates were unpredictable, and maybe Vanessa was simply running late. After all had happened, people got stuck in traffic, lost track of time, or had last-minute emergencies. He lifted the glass of water in front of him, took a careful sip, and glanced toward the door. A couple entered, their hands intertwined, laughter spilling between them as they passed by his table. The maitre d' greeted them warmly and led them to their seats. Ethan's gaze lingered on the entrance a moment longer, waiting, hoping. 5 minutes passed, then 10. He checked his watch again, subtle enough that no one could see his impatience, but deliberate enough to reassure himself. He was still early, technically. Vanessa could walk in at any moment. She would smile, apologize, and the evening would continue as planned. That was what he told himself, though a faint unease began to creep in. Another group entered, then another. The restaurant was alive with motion, yet the woman he was waiting for never appeared. The candle on his table flickered softly as the server approached, her notepad in hand, her smile polite. "Would you like to order a drink while you wait, sir?" Ethan hesitated. He never hesitated. "I'll have a glass of red," he said finally, his voice calm, though a trace of tension edged it. The server nodded and slipped away. Ethan leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks, a gesture more out of habit than necessity. His eyes drifted once more to the door. Still nothing. 20 minutes now. His confidence began to waver. He noticed a couple seated 2 tables away steal a glance in his direction, their whispers just quiet enough to make him wonder if they were talking about him. He was used to being noticed, but not like this. Not as a man sitting alone at a table meant for 2. The server returned with his drink, setting it down gently. "Will your guest be joining you soon?" she asked softly. Ethan forced a polite smile. She should be here any moment. But the truth weighed heavier with each passing second. His jaw tightened as he swirled the wine in his glass, watching the dark liquid catch the light. He had been stood up before in his younger years, before the wealth, before the name, but never like this. Not when he had carefully carved out time in a schedule that demanded every second. Not when he had allowed himself to hope. 30 minutes. Still no Vanessa. The restaurant around him seemed louder now. The laughter brighter. The conversations more intimate. The clinking of silverware sharper. It was as if the entire room had conspired to highlight his solitude. For a man who built empires, who commanded respect with a single glance, sitting there alone became something strangely unbearable. He pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolling through messages just to occupy his hands. No missed calls. No texts. No explanation. Vanessa had vanished before even appearing. And as realization settled in, a mixture of emotions followed. Annoyance. Embarrassment. But beneath it all, a deeper sting disappointment. He hadn't expected perfection, but he had expected something. A conversation, an attempt, a chance. Instead, he was left with nothing but the eyes of strangers and the quiet humiliation of a night gone wrong. The waitress, the same one who had served him earlier, passed by again, balancing a tray with practiced ease. She gave him a glance, not pitying, not mocking, but observant. It was subtle, but he noticed it. And for a reason he couldn't quite explain. That look lingered in his mind. Ethan Cole, the man who always had the upper hand, was left alone at his table, staring into the flickering candlelight, wondering how a night meant for connection had unraveled into silence. What he didn't know was that his evening hadn't truly begun. The woman who would change everything about this night was already here. She wasn't dressed in designer clothes. She wasn't introduced by a mutual friend. And she wasn't the woman he was supposed to meet. She was a waitress. And her name was Lila Ramirez. The wine glass was half empty now, though Ethan hadn't really tasted a drop. He stared into it, swirling the deep red liquid slowly, as if it could offer him an answer. The restaurant was alive with movement, yet his table felt like an island, cut off, silent, out of place. The empty chair across from him seemed louder than all the conversations combined. That was when he noticed her again. The waitress, the one who had been glancing in his direction throughout the evening. She moved with ease between tables, balancing trays, greeting guests with a practiced smile. But there was something about her presence, an energy he couldn't ignore. She wasn't polished in the way women in his circles were. No designer dress, no diamond jewelry, no calculated charm. Her uniform was simple, her hair tied back, a few loose strands framing her face. Yet there was a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself, as though she knew exactly who she was and didn't need anyone else's approval. Her name tag read Lila. When she approached his table again, it wasn't with pity nor with forced courtesy. Her eyes held something else. Curiosity. "Would you like to see the menu again?" she asked gently, though her voice carried a subtle warmth. Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze. For a moment, he considered brushing it off, sending her away with a polite word. That was what he normally did. Keep people at a distance. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was already sitting in the middle of failure, already stripped of the control he valued so much. He set the glass down. "Actually, I was supposed to have dinner with someone." She didn't show. Lila didn't flinch. She didn't offer him the usual hollow sympathies. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her lips curving in the faintest of smiles. Her loss. It was such a simple response, yet it struck him. Most people would have rushed to comfort, to smooth over the awkwardness. But this young woman, a waitress who had probably seen every kind of customer imaginable, didn't try to fill the silence with empty words. She just said what she thought. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her more closely. He saw a woman who had probably worked this job long enough to learn patience, but also one who carried herself like she belonged to more than just the role she was playing tonight. Almost without thinking, the words slipped out. "Why don't you sit down?" Lila blinked, taken aback. "Sit down?" "Yes," Ethan said, gesturing toward the empty chair. "I reserved this table for two, and right now it's just me. I'd rather not finish this evening alone." She hesitated. This wasn't in the script of her shift. Waitresses didn't sit down with customers, especially not ones like him. Her eyes flicked toward her manager across the room, then back to Ethan. "I'm not sure that's allowed." He gave a small, disarming smile, the kind that closed countless business deals. "I'll handle it. Consider it a break. Dinner on me?" Lila crossed her arms lightly, not intimidated but thoughtful. "And what if I don't feel like being someone's backup plan?" Ethan froze for a second. No one ever spoke to him like that in his world. People went out of their way to please him, to accommodate him, to win his favor. But this waitress, this Lila, challenged him in the very first breath. Instead of irritation, he felt something else. Amusement, curiosity, respect. "Fair enough," he said softly. "But I promise you that's not what this is. I just don't want a night to be wasted. And something tells me you'd make far better company than an empty chair." Her eyes searched his for a long moment, weighing him, testing him. Then, slowly, she pulled out the chair and sat down. Not timidly, not apologetically, but with the quiet poise of someone who knew her own worth. "All right then," she said, settling in. "But if I'm sitting here, we do this my way." Ethan raised a brow. "Your way?" Lila nodded. No rehearsed CEO stories. No talk about stocks or mergers or how many cars you own. If we're going to talk, I want real conversation. "Deal." For a moment, Ethan was speechless. He wasn't used to being told how things were going to be, but the honesty in her tone disarmed him. He found himself nodding. "Deal." And just like that, the dynamic of the evening shifted. The empty chair was no longer a reminder of rejection. It was filled by someone who had walked into his night completely uninvited, yet somehow exactly when he needed it most. Ethan Cole, the man who controlled everything, had just given up control to a waitress named Lila Ramirez. And though he didn't know it yet, this unexpected choice would change the course of his night, and maybe even his life. The clinking of silverware and the murmur of conversation surrounded them, but at Ethan's table, the world seemed to pause. For the first time all evening, the empty chair across from him was no longer a symbol of rejection. Lila sat there, her posture relaxed yet confident, her dark eyes sharp with curiosity. Ethan wasn't used to this. He was used to dinners that followed a script, polished introductions, small talk about business, polite laughter at predictable jokes. But with Lila, there was no script. She had made that clear. So, she began, leaning forward slightly. What's the real reason you asked me to sit down? Because I don't believe for a second that it's just about avoiding an empty chair. Her words caught him off guard. Most people never dared to question his motives. But here she was, cutting straight through his charm as though it meant nothing. Ethan smiled faintly, tried to regain his footing. You want the truth? I think I just said that, she replied. He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. All right, the truth is, I didn't want to be alone tonight. I cleared my schedule for someone who didn't bother to show, and for a man who prides himself on control. That doesn't happen often. Sitting here, watching everyone else enjoy their evening while mine fell apart. He paused, lowering his voice slightly. It was unbearable. Then I saw you, and you didn't look at me the way everyone else does. Her expression softened just a fraction. And how exactly does everyone else look at you? Ethan considered this. Like they're calculating, measuring, deciding if I'm worth admiring, resenting, or chasing after. But you looked at me like I was just a man sitting at a table. Lila tilted her head, as though weighing his words. That's because you are. It was so simple, so obvious, yet it hit him harder than any flattery ever had. The waiter arrived with their food, setting the plates down carefully before retreating. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, the candlelight flickering between them. Lila picked up her fork, then looked at him again. I almost said no. To joining me? Ethan asked. To everything, she said. To this job, to working here. I've lost count of the number of times I've thought about walking away. But life doesn't always give you the luxury of choosing what you want. Sometimes it's just about surviving. Ethan studied her. And yet here you are. She gave a small shrug. Bills don't pay themselves. My brother's tuition doesn't pay itself. You do what you have to do. Something shifted inside him. This was not the kind of conversation he was used to. Most women he dined with spoke of vacations, handbags, social events. But Lila's words carried weight. Responsibility. Sacrifice. And you? She asked suddenly, turning the question back on him. Why do you do what you do? Do you even like it? Or is it just about staying on top? Her bluntness made him pause. He had never been asked that in such a raw, unpolished way. Not even by people closest to him. I started my company because I believe I could build something better, he said slowly. And for a while it was about passion, innovation, change. But somewhere along the way, it became about keeping what I had built, about not letting anyone take it from me. Lila tapped her fork against her plate thoughtfully. Sound exhausting. He let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. It is. The conversation flowed like that, honest, unfiltered. Ethan found himself admitting things he rarely said aloud. How success had brought isolation, how every friendship felt like a transaction, how trust had become almost impossible. And in turn, Lila revealed her struggles. Working double shifts, studying at night, dreaming of opening her own business someday, but constantly pulled back by the weight of responsibility. At one point, Ethan leaned forward, genuinely intrigued. What kind of business? Her eyes lit up just for a moment with a spark of passion. A small cafe, nothing fancy. A place where people feel welcome the second they walk in. Good coffee, good food, good music. A place that feels alive. Not like this. She gestured subtly at the restaurant around them, with its polished atmosphere and carefully curated exclusivity. This feels cold, pretentious. I want the opposite of that. Ethan smiled. You'd make it work. I can see it in the way you talk about it. Lila gave him a long look, as if trying to decide if he was teasing her or being sincere. Eventually, she nodded. Maybe, but dreams don't mean much when reality keeps pulling you back down. There was silence between them for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, meaningful. Ethan realized he hadn't felt this kind of conversation in years. Real, raw, and stripped of pretense. "You know," Lila said at last, her tone lighter, "for a CEO, you're surprisingly easy to talk to." He raised a brow. "Surprisingly? Well, I expected arrogance. Maybe a little ego. But instead," she smiled faintly, "you're just a man who got stood up on a date." Ethan laughed. Genuinely this time, the sound surprising even him. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed without restraint. For the first time all night, he didn't feel the sting of humiliation. He didn't feel like a man who had been abandoned. He felt like someone who had been given a second chance, an unexpected one. And as the minutes stretched into hours, Ethan realized something startling. The woman who was supposed to meet him tonight might have never mattered at all, because across the table sat someone who challenged him, humbled him, and, without even trying, reminded him what it meant to truly connect. The candle between them had burned lower now, its flames smaller, softer, but still steady. The night had drifted past in a way Ethan hadn't expected. What began as an awkward, humiliating evening had turned into something strangely grounding. Lila wasn't impressed by his status, nor was she intimidated by it. And for a man who lived in a world where everyone measured him by his last deal or his net worth, that was nothing short of disarming. But as their plates were cleared and the hum of the restaurant grew quieter, Ethan sensed there was more to Lila than what she had shared. There was a weight in her words, a shadow in her smile, something unspoken that lingered beneath the surface. He leaned forward, his voice low but earnest. "You carry yourself like someone who's had to fight harder than most. You talk about surviving, about responsibilities, but you haven't told me everything, have you?" Lila froze for a moment, her fork resting on the plate she had barely touched. Her eyes flicked downward, then back to him, studying his face as if deciding whether or not he could handle the truth. "You really want to know?" she asked softly. "Yes," Ethan said. "I do." She drew in a breath, her shoulders squaring, her expression shifting into something more vulnerable than he'd seen all night. "My brother," she began, "is 17. His name is Diego. Smart kid. Smarter than me, probably. But life hasn't exactly made things easy for him. After our dad left and my mom got sick, it fell on me to keep things together. Working nights, weekends, double shifts, whatever it took. Every dollar I make goes toward rent, bills, and keeping him in school. The cafe I told you about earlier, that's not just a dream. It's the only way I see us breaking free. A chance to give him the life I never had." Her words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and impossible to ignore. Ethan felt something stir in him, something he hadn't expected. He had sat across from countless powerful men and women who bragged about their successes, who wore their ambitions like medals. But here was Lila, a waitress scraping together every cent she could, and her vision wasn't about power or prestige. It was about survival, about love, about family. For a long moment, he didn't know what to say. "That's why you work here," he murmured finally. "Why you put up with rude customers, long hours, exhaustion, because of him." She nodded, her lips pressed together. "Because of him. Everything I do, every shift I take, is for Diego. He deserves better than this. And if that means I sacrifice a little more, then so be it." Ethan's chest tightened. He had spent his life building an empire, convinced that power was the only thing worth chasing. But listening to her, he realized she was richer in ways he had never been. Her wealth was measured in loyalty, in resilience, in love strong enough to carry someone else's future on her back. And then came the revelation that truly stunned him. Lila's gaze steadied on him, unflinching. "The truth is, when I saw you sitting here alone, I almost didn't come over. I thought, why waste my time on another man in a suit who thinks the world owes him something? But then I thought of Diego, and I thought, maybe if I sat down, maybe if I opened up, maybe I'd learn something. Something that could help me. Something that could help him." Ethan stared at her, the weight of her honesty hitting him like a blow. For once, someone had not approached him for money, for status, or for favors. She had approached him with nothing but truth, and in doing so, had exposed the emptiness of his carefully curated life. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You've stunned me, Lila." Her brows lifted slightly. Why? Because you're stronger than anyone I've met in years, he admitted. And you don't even see it. You think you're just surviving. But what you're doing takes more courage than most CEOs could ever dream of, myself included. For the first time all evening, her composure cracked. A small smile tugged at her lips, faint but real. You don't know me well enough to say that. Maybe not, Ethan said, his voice steady. But tonight, I'd like to. Their eyes locked across the table. The silence between them filled not with awkwardness, but with a connection deeper than either had anticipated. In a single evening, Ethan Cole had gone from being stood up, humiliated and alone, to sitting across from a woman who revealed more of herself in 1 hour than most people had ever dared. And though he didn't know it yet, her revelation was only the beginning of what this night would mean for him. The restaurant had quieted, the music softer now, the night pushing steadily forward. Ethan leaned back in his chair, still processing everything Lila had revealed. Her honesty, her resilience, her rawness. It wasn't just admirable, it was magnetic. For a man who was used to controlling every detail of his life, this night had unfolded in ways he never could have scripted. But Lila wasn't finished with him yet. She tilted her head, her eyes glimmering with something that wasn't quite mischief, but wasn't entirely serious either. You know, she said, for a man who claims to be in control of everything, you don't seem very good at handling surprises. Ethan raised a brow, amused. Is that so? Absolutely, Lila replied. You've spent the whole night trying to regain your footing. But maybe the problem isn't the world, maybe it's you. You don't know how to let go. He chuckled under his breath, swirling what was left in his wine glass. And what do you suggest I do about that? Lila leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table. A challenge. Right here. Right now. Ethan's interest peaked. No one challenged him like this. People avoided ruffling his feathers, careful not to overstep. But Lila wasn't like most people. What kind of challenge? He asked. She considered him for a moment, as though searching for just the right test. Then her smile spread slowly, deliberately. For the rest of this night, you're not Ethan Cole, CEO. You're just Ethan. No titles, no status, no pulling strings to get your way. Just you. Do you think you can handle that? Ethan almost laughed, but something in her gaze told him she was serious. You think I hide behind my title? I don't think, she said softly. I know. People like you, men who build empires, you get so used to the world bending around you that you forget what it feels like to simply exist, to be human. Her words struck deeper than he expected, and though his instinct was to deflect, to brush it off with a clever remark, something inside him told him this was exactly the kind of challenge he needed. He set his glass down, leaning closer. All right then, I'll play along. Just Ethan, no CEO. But tell me, what does that mean? What are the rules of this little game? Lila's smile widened. Simple. You follow my lead for the rest of the night. Whatever I say, you do. No complaints. No negotiations. No hiding behind your wallet. Just trust me. His brows lifted slightly. Trust you? Yes, she said firmly. That's part of the challenge. Can you? Ethan hesitated. Trust wasn't something that came easily to him. In business, trust was a weakness. It meant giving someone else the power to ruin you. But here, across the table from this woman who had already dismantled so many of his defenses, he found himself wanting to take the risk. Finally, he nodded. All right, Lila, you have my word. Lead the way. Her expression softened, as though she hadn't fully expected him to agree. Good, she said, because if I'm going to sit at this table with you, I want to know who Ethan really is. Not the man everyone reads about in magazines, but the man who laughs at stupid jokes, the man who doesn't always have the answers, the man who might even, she paused, a playful spark in her eye, be willing to embarrass himself a little. He gave a low laugh, shaking his head. Embarrass myself? That's asking a lot. That's the point, she countered. If you can't laugh at yourself, then what's the use of everything you built? For the first time that evening, Ethan felt the weight of his title slip from his shoulders. He wasn't Mr. Cole here. He wasn't the billionaire CEO with a reputation to uphold. He was just a man sitting across from a woman who saw him differently than anyone else ever had. The challenge wasn't about proving his strength. It was about surrendering it. And that, more than anything, stunned him. He raised his glass, meeting her eyes across the table. To the challenge, and Lila lifted her water glass, clinking it softly against his. To the challenge. Neither of them knew exactly what the night would bring. But for Ethan Cole, one thing was certain. He was about to step out of the world he knew, and into one defined not by control, but by trust, and by a waitress named Lila Ramirez, who refused to let him hide. The restaurant had quieted down, but for Ethan and Lila, the night was just beginning. Lila stood, apron still tied, and gestured toward the door. Come on. You didn't think this challenge would happen while you sat here sipping wine, did you? Amused, Ethan followed her out into the glowing city. She led him through streets he'd never walked, past food carts, musicians, and shops far from the glass towers he called home. They stopped at a tamale stand. Lila handed him one with a grin. You've never lived until you've had this. One bite, and Ethan realized she was right. Standing there on the sidewalk, eating street food, laughing freely, he felt more alive than he had in years. Later, they slipped into a tiny jazz bar, the trumpet filling the air with raw, unpolished beauty. Lila leaned close. Here, no one cares who you are. You just exist. And he did. They shared stories, childhood memories, mistakes, small joys. Ethan spoke of fishing trips with his grandfather. Lila told of cardboard forts collapsing in the night. They laughed until their sides hurt. When they finally stepped back outside, Ethan smiled softly. I think I did more than survive tonight. I think I lived. And for the first time in a long time, he truly meant it. By the time they stopped walking, the city was nearly silent. Ethan said quietly, I never imagined a night would end like this. Lila smirked. Honestly, when I saw you sitting there, I thought you looked like trouble. He laughed, but then asked the question on his mind. Why did you really sit with me? She hesitated, then admitted, because I knew who you were. Everyone knows Ethan Cole, but I didn't care about that. I just want to see if you were real. The confession stunned him. She went on. And one more thing you should know, that cafe I dream about, I've been saving, but I'm still short. I swore I'd never ask you for help. If you ever offered, I needed it to be real, not pity. For Ethan, her honesty was unlike anything he'd known. He stepped closer. Then let me promise you this. If I ever help, it won't be charity. It'll be because you've earned it, and you have. They stood under the streetlight, bound not by power or wealth, but by respect. Tonight began as a disaster, Ethan said, but you made it unforgettable. Then maybe, she smiled, it wasn't disaster after all. What began as a blind date gone wrong became a night Ethan Cole would never forget. Vanessa never showed. No explanation. But if she had, Ethan never would have noticed a waitress who sat at his table and changed everything. Lila reminded him of what he'd lost. Simplicity, joy, connection. She stripped away the armor of titles and power, leaving only Ethan the man. The night wasn't about being stood up. It wasn't about disappointment. It was about connection. About how sometimes the people who change us forever aren't the ones we expect, but the ones who appear when everything falls apart. Maybe that's a lesson. Wealth fades, power shifts, titles are forgotten. But kindness, honesty, and the courage to be real, those last. So the next time life doesn't go as planned, remember Ethan and Lila. Sometimes being stood up isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of one you never saw coming. And that's the story of how one forgotten night turned into a lesson neither of them would ever forget. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful connections come from the most unexpected places. If this story touched you, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves a good twist of fate. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in Ethan or Lila's shoes? Let me know down in the comments. This is Heartfelt Tales TV, where every story is more than just words. It's a reminder of what truly matters. Until next time, Keep your heart open, because the next tale might just find you